services to more than 1,000 NGO. They may that be international or local NGO everywhere in the world in high-risk countries. I've worked myself a lot with INSO in these countries, so it's a pleasure to meet Nick today. So INSO also maintains the most comprehensive data available on conflict and humanitarian safety. Also, we have Camille Gilardo, who is here with us. Camille works with IRC. IRC is the International Rescue Committee, so it's a very big NGO that is present in so many countries. I don't even know how many. So Camille has been working with IRC since 2019 as the Regional Safety and Security Director. When she joined, she was the first female security director with IRC, but now there are 3 of them. So I completely relate to that. I also was the first female head of security regional for NRC back in those days. You cover 9 countries in your region, countries that are where we can still observe massive displacements due to ongoing conflict, terrorist attack, and also climate events. And you're coming from program background, which is going to be extremely interesting when talking about security of safe delivery of programs. Heather Hughes, who is here with us, is the Deputy Director of the Global Interagency Security Forum, GISF. And before that, she was working with Oxfam for more than 20 years, and she was the first Global Security Advisor for Oxfam GB. GISF, formerly known as EISF, for those who don't know this organization, is a member-led NGO with a global network of over 130 member organizations, and they are committed to improving safety and security for aid workers and operation. So GISF proposes original researches, collaborations, and events such as forums and conferences in order to drive positive change in security management across the humanitarian sector. Thank you very much for being here, Heather. And last but not least, Manuel Patrouillard, he's here with us as well. So Manuel worked at first 6 years in the construction and telecom business, and then 13 years with McKinsey, steering large international teams on every continent. And since 2014, he joined Humanity and Inclusion and Handicap International, and as the Global Managing Director, and since then he has been focusing on implementing an ambitious strategy to address the rapidly increasing need for humanitarian aid. As for myself, I'm Oriane Arnoux-Balourdet. I'm a Senior Security and Safety Advisor with over 10 years of experience in NGOs. I've worked with different organizations and also with the French 4-Night Crisis Center in Paris for a time. I'm currently working with NRC, and I've been with them for the last 5 years. And I have occupied different positions, including Regional Head of Security and more recently, Global Roving Security Manager. Without further delay, I think we can start discussing the sessions that occupy us today, and this is to discuss how we can improve the protection of humanitarian personnel in the field and specifically in high-risk areas. So I propose that we start with our first panelist, Nick, who is going to talk to us about how did the security of humanitarian aid workers changed over time in this high-risk country. What's the change that we observed in the last year, so in the last few years. So please, Nick, please go ahead. You can use this. No, I think you have to.
It's already on. Okay, everyone here is okay. Thank you, Oriane. Thank you for the wonderful introductions. Pleasure to be here. So I have been asked to comment under the title, Don't Shoot, I'm an Aid Worker, which I thought sounded like I'm a celebrity, get me out of here, but I'll try to make it not quite so trivial. You know, I think it's an interesting title, and I want to try to unpack it a little bit around 2 core concepts. Really the first around the question of are aid workers targeted, and what targeted really means. And then the flip side of that question is, well, whether they are or not, does a humanitarian identity actually confer any protection in this day and age? So I think these are really the 2 core parts of that. On the first part as to whether we're targeted or not as a community, I think you might be surprised to find the answer, in my opinion, is no, in the sense that we don't observe in any of the countries that we cover a deliberate, sustained, policy-based targeting of NGOs. Now, certainly it's the case that tragic, isolated exceptions do occur to this, but from the point of view of armed groups out there who have a deliberate, conscious, policy-based intent to target NGOs. This is not something we see, either in practical experience or in any of the data that we gather around the way that aid workers are exposed to violence in any of these countries. So I think it's a really important, starting observation. But it doesn't really, it's really the only good news within that story. So even though we are not directly targeted as a matter of policy, like I said, of course, we are extremely vulnerable to the conflicts that we work in this day and age. And I think, to try and characterize those a little bit in terms of how they look, I don't propose that any of this is really different over time. I'm not a subscriber that conflict has particularly changed over time, or the vulnerability of civilians has changed over time either. I think, going back to Vietnam and Bosnia and Rwanda, you certainly had a lot of the same traits. But I think to kind of characterize, some of the main points, I think, highly protracted in the first place. So, from my own organization's experience, we go into countries and we never leave. And I know that's, generally the case for most operational NGOs as well. So conflicts are no longer things that go on, a couple of months, couple of years. They're essentially open-ended and don't really have a lot of end state in sight. The proliferation of, let's say, unconventional, by which I can say non-state or sub-state, actors, and extreme degrees of factionalism within that. Any of you that worked on the Syria conflict, for instance, will know that it was a daily job just to keep track of the constantly changing organizations and allegiances that were popping up in that. So this really extreme factionalism, I think, is a really powerful dynamic in undermining humanitarian presence, humanitarian access. The unconventional nature of warfare these days. We've moved on from kind of, frontline positional warfare, and war is in the cities now. It's in the streets. It's in the communities. It's identity-based. So that brings, explosives to urban environments. It brings deliberate targeting of civilians based on religion or ethnicity or tribe or other form of identity. So those are really big challenges. I would say that the most modern conflicts are also characterized by a general impunity for violations, for war crimes, for IHL violations. I'm sure there are plenty of people in this room. I've had friends and colleagues murdered who I know no one has ever been held account for that. No one has ever been arrested. No one's ever been brought to trial. No one's ever, even been questioned over that. So the lived experience of a humanitarian is basically a lack of accountability, a lack of justice, effectively, for anything. And I think finally the last part is around politicization. And okay, this isn't new. We had the diplomacy, development, and defense. We've had triple nexus. We've had PRTs. In every kind of context, you have increased pressures put on the independence of humanitarian action that I think causes stresses as well. So I think that's how I would kind of define and categorize modern conflicts. In terms of what impact does that have on us as a community, and I'll just throw some figures out for you. I looked at our database before coming here. For 2021 alone, 1,600 security incidents affecting NGOs across the countries that we cover. That's 1,600. This included an aid worker killed, injured, or abducted every day of that year. So more than 365. I think it's about 67 killed. It was about 129 abducted and over 250 injured. So on the kind of standard industrial classification scale, I think aid worker ranks somewhere between, garbage truck driver and farmer. I think we have a death ratio, a fatality rate of about 24 per 100,000, which certainly is high enough to rank it in, the top 25 most dangerous job classifications, but okay, it's certainly not like being in the military. So I think in terms of types, it's important, I think, for you all to know that, like, consistent with what I said about not being targeted at the beginning, the vast majority of NGO incidents, certainly for 2021, and this goes back all the years that we have on record, will generally be collateral in nature. So just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, too close to an explosion, too close to an attack on a checkpoint, too close to an airstrike, and collateral really counts for the largest proportion of NGO incidents in each country that we cover. The second portion is when an NGO is involved, but it's actually just an NGO personnel. So and maybe they're off duty, maybe they're on duty, but it's not really directly related to the work of the organization. So it's good for you to understand that when NGOs are involved in these things, principally they're being involved either collaterally or just because they employ a lot of people in highly volatile situations. The single most common cause of NGO incidents, the single most type of NGO incidents is robberies, thefts, either in compounds, principally on the road. These will often be armed, either with light weapons or with machetes and so on. So this is a real exposure point, and I'm sure all of us as operational NGOs have been in some situation where your house is looted, your vehicle is stopped, and this is really the principal way that NGOs are being targeted in that more specific instance. And for all of those incidents that we classify as targeted within our grouping, half of those are robberies. So at least half of those are targeted, let's say, for economic purposes. Around 16% or so of the total are actual attacks, which again, small arms, light weapons, handheld weapons, so on and so forth. Is that my time? Okay. No, it's not? Okay, it's totally off. How am I doing?
You have to wrap up now.
Oh, okay, fine. Well, I'll just quickly say, in terms of how the system has evolved, a couple of really good points for me. I think it's moved a long way. We have evolved on from kind of UN-centric systems and ad hoc approaches. I see a lot of good security risk management capacity, a lot of good coordination, and I think generally kind of unprecedented levels of support and capability on the NGO side, but still a lot that has to be done, and I'll leave that to the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I was very interested by the figures that you gave to us, and I think this is really something that we can discuss a little bit later. I will just remind for the person who are online, don't hesitate to raise questions on the platform. We will have quite a long part of this session that are going to be dedicated to Q&As, and we really want to hear from you, and you have this opportunity to ask questions to the panel. So thank you very much, Nick. I think we will continue right away with Camille. And Camille, I think you have prepared something from us on the question of that security is not just nice to have. And I think we can have such reassuring somehow figures because, as you say, maybe we are not so much a target that sometimes we might think, and maybe the number of incidents is quite impressive, of course, but it could be much worse if we didn't have the security measures in place that we have already. So I think, Camille, you are going to explain us more about this and how do we foster the idea in the organization, I would say in the program cycle for the program, that security is not just optional or an add-on.
Thank you very much. When I was preparing this talk, I was wondering, do we really need to be convinced by the fact that security is not only a nice to have, but it's a must to have? Really? Do we? Do I really need to convince you? So maybe I will stop here. But since this morning, I'm quite reassured and glad to have heard from the first talk, like the commissioner spoke about security and the need to improve, to increase the security of our aid workers. So I think I will not go through what I prepared, and I wanted to give you an example, but I think we are fine with this idea that security is not only a nice to have. We know that most of our ENGOs, international or national, we are willing to go further, deeper, faster, to go in more remote area, because this is where the needs are. We want to touch the most vulnerable one. We want to go in those remote areas. And most of the time, they are the area the most dangerous. So here today, we are here to discuss about this question about security is not only a nice to have. In one of the consultations, which happened in Nairobi in November this last year, there was a forum. It was named Access and Protection of Humanitarian Workers. And one of the key points was that going further, going deeper, going to location with higher risk requires more security investment. Not only financially, of course it was for the donors, the target was for the donors, so it was, we need more money because we want more protection equipment and to afford this high security. But I would go further and say it's not only for the donors, it's also among us, and not only from the security department. It's a collective work which needs to be done at different levels. We know that without a proper security management, incident will happen. Externally, internally, what can happen? A car accident could be more or less severe, but if we reduce the cost, very often we go for rental car. What does it mean? It means maybe that we will be exposed to more incidents because we don't have the proper car maintenance. Our drivers are not trained properly because we don't choose the driver. So reducing the cost means that we have a more severe incident. We can be sued by our own staff because we don't have the proper adapted security management to the risk that we face. And of course, on the worst case, we could have staff deaths or kidnapped because maybe we have a lack of proper policies in place, or even sometimes for the biggest organization, I work for IRC, we have a lot of policies, but sometimes we don't implement the SOPs. So this can also happen. Then the question is, how are we sure that we have the right approach as an ENGO, as a donor, as a partner, and that we have a proper security management? I would just have a look at the duty of care, you know, how important it is. Duty of care is a term that refers to the obligation carried by an organization to provide to our staff physical, mental safety, security, health, and well-being. We see here the word obligation. It's not an option. It's not a nice to have. It's legal, it's contractual, it's ethical most of the time, and for some of our organizations, it's even mandatory. There is ISO norms. There is clauses integrated in our MOUs with the grants, with partners. So how do we do that concretely? Of course, this is a question. I think, again, it's a joint collaboration, a coherent approach. I would say there is 4 levels. The first one is at staff level. One of the most significant principle for me is the individual right to withdraw. When you are working on the field, and this is where my background of program comes, when I was a head worker on the field at remote area, I would have been glad, and I was glad for the ENGO with who I work. I got all the information and the equipment to feel safe. But this principle of individual right to withdraw, allow our staff to say, no, I don't feel safe. I don't want to go to this field because I don't have the proper information or I don't have the perfect equipment. I'm not equipped in all the sense to go there. I think this one is very important that we implement this one. Then I think it's also important to take the diversity point of view. And we know that in our workforce, we are not equipped in the same way. We are not equal in front of threats. So this is very important to take all our identities or capacity into consideration. It could be gender, of course, we are speaking a lot about this. It could be the religion, it could be sexual orientation or other characteristic. And this is not a nice to have. It's a must to have, legally and ethically, of course. Then I would say come the organizational level. If our leaders are not committed, accountable for security management, it will not work. We need to make sure that our leaders are convinced that security is not an option. How can they do that? Through budget, through disciplinary action, maybe we can discuss in the talk after. And then, of course, at the external level, our capacity to convince the donors and the partners that security is not only a nice to have is crucial. When it's obvious, we don't need advocacy, but I think passion is very important in our argument to make sure that they understand and that we speak the same language. Are we waiting for the donors or collaborators to influence our security? Or do we want to be proactive and to show them, to make them accountable to? Or we have also the choice to wait the worst to happen and then to pay for that. It might be even less costly to wait financially, but humanly, what? So I think, to conclude, that more we will create a global understanding of what means security management, and more we will be fully part of our global policy, and to make them mandatory, then more we will build a solid approach. We will be able to go stronger, further, safer in those remote areas that we want to explore. Because at the end, and I will quote my colleague here, Heather, one day she said, at the end, if our staff are not safe while we are operating on the ground, then we can't help the one we are here to help. We fail our mission just because we thought that security was just an option.
Thank you very much, Camille, for this passionate advocacy for increased security support in high-risk country. And I will actually say not only in high-risk country, but everywhere. Security is very expensive. I think all of us here, we have heard that in our career. That's one of the major push that we receive when we are a security manager. I think, and you say it very well, when you're a security manager on the ground, you should not have to explain to the staff that they want to stay safe, but sometimes we have to do that. And we should not have to explain to the manager that they want their staff to be safe, but sometimes we also have to do that. So yes, security is expensive, can be expensive. Is it that expensive? I'm not so sure. But then, because we are here at ECHO's invitation, and ECHO is also one of the major donors for most of the organization, we can also question what can a donor do to support their partners, like IRC, like NRC, but also local partners that may not have developed their security system so much in developing this system, in implementing a sound security risk management system to the profit, not only of the staff, but also to the delivery of the program for the beneficiary. And this is the question I'm going to ask to Heather.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. My presentation builds a bit on the previous discussions from 2021 and the outcomes of that series of discussions on ensuring the protection, safety and security of humanitarian workers and medical personnel in armed conflicts. That was a series of discussions from last year. And I'm going to focus on 3 areas where GISF feels that donors in particular can better support partners in implementing a stronger and a sound security risk management system. So the first one is around collaboration. So GISF and other organisations have been working for many years to improve the safety and security of aid workers in order to maintain humanitarian access for populations in need. And that's the key thing to think about, is that what we all do is about ensuring our organisations can meet their objectives and access populations in need. We do it collaboratively, bringing together international and local organisations, UN, donors, academia, private sector. So we learn from each other, build the capacity of humanitarian organisations to better understand and manage their security risks. As has been mentioned already, often the interest in security risk management from NGOs, from the staff, from management, boards, supporters, donors even, tragically comes on the back of very terrible incidents. And these involve deaths, injuries, kidnaps, and long-term, sometimes life-changing effects on not only on staff, but also on their families and their colleagues. And also, often we have these discussions on the back of very difficult, complex and insecure operating environments. I know in the past year we've been supporting kind of collaborative events on Ethiopia, Haiti, Afghanistan, Yemen, of course now Ukraine and others. I mean, those are just a few. And these are the kind of contexts that we're operation organisations are working in all the time. But it's just an important note to think that our conversations and thinking about these issues shouldn't subside as our memories of these particularly difficult events subside. But through collaborative networks, organisations have been able to, or have been helped to develop their strategic security risk management, strategy, policy, and so on, learning from other organisations, experiences and practices at HQ level. A recent GISF webinar on supporting families during kidnap incidents held in collaboration with Hostage International was able to bring together a very wide range of participants from international organisations, local organisations, risk management companies, UN, even police forces, and the US Army attended that and were able to share experiences and learn from others in the sector. And through collaborative networks, organisations are also able to contribute to sector-wide learning, not just sort of glean things from it, but contribute themselves, contribute their own knowledge and experiences, contributing to best practice, and through their participation in events and research and developing guides and so on. And this provides learning for the whole sector, which is our recent work to shift policy and practice away from compliance and towards a more person-centred approach to SRM demonstrates the number of organisations that have been involved in that work and have contributed to the thinking and taking it forward. And also having a network behind you and supporting you, it gives organisations confidence. It builds resilience to get into humanitarian crisis sooner and to stay there for longer. It provides you with a range of experts that you can help support you meet your goals and objectives, and offers practical support, such as recently we were able to connect an organisation with INSO actually directly, whose staff were stuck in Ukraine with no support, and to try and get some direct assistance. And as more organisations work in alliances and in consortia, collaborative networks develop further the idea of risk sharing as not just vertically between INGOs, local organisations and donors, who generally have the power over resources and funding, but also horizontally with organisations who are working collaboratively, working in networks, sharing resources, sharing information and knowledge, and improving security risk management for all organisations. So GISF is able to help make those connections and share good practices, delivering a widely appreciated public good for the NGO community, not just for our own members, which enhances the capacity of NGOs to operate in these high-risk contexts. Some donors may have been concerned in the past about funding security risk management, either because of perceived liability issues or because they don't necessarily see the direct link with security risk management and humanitarian operations. Many donors have funded, and the UK FCDO and US Aid have directly funded GISF and INSO and others to improve effectiveness and efficiency of humanitarian responses through projects which directly support security risk management. And obviously, hopefully, we hope that they will continue to do this, and we hope that other donors will also consider this approach, supporting collaborative strategic networks that enable organisations to learn and build capacity collectively, and that provide public goods that support humanitarian organisations to achieve overall effectiveness of responses. This has a multiplying effect on the protection of aid workers. My second point, really much shorter point, is on direct costs, which is that NGOs do need to get better at calculating the costs associated with security risk management systems. We need to get better at identifying and asking for the resources that we actually require to ensure the safe and secure delivery of humanitarian aid. Security costs should be seen as a direct cost rather than part of an overhead, and should include what we might consider to be soft costs. It's quite easy to think about you need extra vehicles or satellite phones or equipment or whatever, but the soft costs, the costs of developing and maintaining acceptance are the costs that are harder to define, but NGOs need to get better at doing that. And donors should agree that security costs are recognised and included in budgets as a direct cost to enable implementation of programmes, not only for INGOs, but also for any local and national organisations and partners that they're working with. And another area is to facilitate long-term funding of appropriate and effective security risk management strategies, including capacity development, which is often considered to be a development rather than a humanitarian response activity. My final point is on local and national NGOs, and particularly on risk sharing. As the aid sector seeks to better support local action, and we've heard again about that already today in a number of sessions, we must ensure that local and national NGOs are able to work in a safe and secure way. Despite the statistics which show that the majority of security incidents affect national NGO staff and organisations, INGO's current approach is often based on risk transfer, and though this might not be intentional, this is often the outcome when responsibility for project and programme implementation is transferred to local and national organisations without the accompanying funding and the accompanying support or capacity development that might be needed to improve security risk management. So we need to be taking a more risk-sharing approach, understanding the risks faced by all partners and discussing these on equal terms, and allocating adequate resources to manage and mitigate those risks. Our recent research found that national and local organisations didn't necessarily want to discuss security issues because they feared losing funding if they brought up security concerns. And just, I guess, to add to that, to achieve this kind of risk-sharing approach, INGOs must first ensure that they have their own security risk management in place and their own capacity sorted out, as many do still struggle with this. So just a final few points that donors need to consider further the idea of risk sharing. They should support capacity building for good security risk management practice for international and national and local NGOs, and ensure that security risk management costs are included as direct costs and passed on to local and national implementing partners. And should also provide strategic and sustainable support. So in conclusion, if I'm allowed a conclusion, donors, I feel, can have a big impact on the safety and security of aid workers, not only by ensuring that security resources are considered when requested, but also to be thinking more proactively about risk sharing, about asking for, making sure and asking for specific budget lines within proposals, And many of the recommendations for all of the actors that we've discussed already identify the fundamental importance of risk sharing and collaboration. And when we work together to share information and learning, and where we can create a space where we can be honest about our security concerns, and where resources are strategic and reach those most at risk, there is an opportunity for sustainable improvement for security of staff across the sector. And donors do have an opportunity there to save money and to save lives. And I mean, this, obviously we're going to have a great conversation now, and we're hoping this is just the start of some conversations. And GISF is working with ECHO to host a discussion at HNPW in May, which will be on taking forward some of these discussions.
Thank you very much, Heather. And I definitely think that there are a couple of points that you raised, including the question of the risk transfer that need to be discussed a little bit more, maybe just after Manuel has intervention. I think there are a few things to dig in there. It's really a chain of risk transfer, because we could argue that donors transfer the risk to implementing partners who sometimes themselves will then transfer the risk, sometimes among their own staff, dividing between international staff and local staff, but also themselves, they may employ implementing partners and further transfer the risk. So how we do ensure that this security management system is streamlined through all the chain, from the donors to the last mile organization, I would say. And I think this is definitely a question that we can raise later in our discussions. Definitely the landscape of NGO is vast and diverse in setup, in the way they organize themselves, in their core competencies, the programs that they want to implement. It's very hard to have a model that would fit everyone. But the question is, should the donor be more systematic in their ask, implement obligations to have this SOP or that tool or this type of system, some kind of minimum requirement standards that a donor should or could impose to an organization to benefit with fundings? And I guess that's the question I'm going to ask you, Manuel.
So thank you for the question. Thank you for welcoming me in this panel. Obviously, there are many things have been said so far. And it's a tricky question, let me tell you, because of course we don't want more standards, we don't want more certification. We have already so much that we cannot deal with everything. But obviously, even though we are not targeted as humanitarian most of the time, we are working in very highly dangerous context. And going in the funeral of one of my dear colleagues was maybe one too much. So obviously, we need to make sure that we have a system in place. And it's true that it's not an option, as you mentioned, Camille. It's a must-do, obviously, but it's not a cheap must-do. It's very expensive. We didn't try. Maybe a few years ago, we had maybe 15 FTEs working in security and access, because we call it security and access. Today we have around 60, so a multiplication by 4. So it's an expensive structure. But we take it very seriously, and that has nothing to do with certification, as you can imagine. It's clearly a duty of care that is driving us. So it's important to mention first that it's security and access. We discussed about risk sharing, but what is important at the end of the day is that we can access. And obviously, accessing our beneficiaries in very highly risky environment is a risk that you can mitigate, but at the end of the day, you don't mitigate 100%. So there is no zero risk. Again, I understand that the question of sharing risk is an important question, but at the end of the day, we need to be ready to go to our colleague funeral. This is part of the job, and this is obviously something that we have to keep in mind. And if there is no agreement on that first point, of course, we should not work on this very highly dangerous environment. Maybe my second point should be, or would be about actually who is responsible. Because we share the risk, but at the end of the day, who is in charge? Actually, the NGO is in charge. And it's true that having a system in place is an important question, and that should be always asked because they are in charge. So if they are in charge without any systems in place, then there is a problem. But we are in charge. It's important to do that, to mention that we have to be on top of the analysis. And that's something that, of course, can be part of a dialogue between donors on NGOs, but we have to be on top of analysis. We are very happy to have mutualized organizations like INSO, Nick, my colleague here on my right, which, of course, provide us with a lot of analysis, but we need to be on top of analysis. But we need also to be on top of analysis. For that, we need to be actually in dialogue with everybody, including armed groups. Therefore, we need to be able to do that without being sued. You know, we can be sued today, and that's another risk for our colleagues. We can be sued by Western governments, we can be sued by local governments just because we discuss with armed groups. So this trade-off between risk and access, it's something that we need to do without under pressure. And I have the feeling that sometimes we have too many pressures. Criminalization of aid is something that is both unacceptable and hypocritical. I think we understand that it's unacceptable because obviously the no-contact policy doesn't work. We have to actually discuss with the different parties. If tomorrow Ansar Allah in Yemen is considered as a foreign terrorist organization by the US, it will be 70% of the Yemen population that we will not have access to anymore. So that's a big risk that we take. And obviously, this is nothing to do with our risk management system. It has to do with regulation that, of course, we need to address. It's unacceptable, but it's also a bit hypocritical because we all know it's an open secret that we discuss with many people. Yes, we discuss with Hamas when we want to go into Gaza. Everybody has to go through Hamas to go into Gaza. And obviously, there are some rules that could put us into a difficult situation. So instead of criminalization, it's really about dialogue. We talk about, you know, whether we should have certification, label, and everything. Well, no, we should have a dialogue. We should have a dialogue with our donors that at the end of the day, the risk is taken by our employees. And I agree with Camille, they have the final say whether they want to withdraw or whether they want to go. And that's the most important, is that the people on the ground have to keep the final say, whatever the regulation, whatever the certification, whatever the label we have. It's true that you need to be in the middle of a food distribution to understand whether you need or you should avoid to have an armed escort. You should be in Bambari, in the middle of Central Africa, in front of fighter and truck drivers, whether you want to have an armed convoy with MINUSCA or not. So that's really something that needs to happen locally by our colleagues and not at any head office or into whatever regulation. Maybe a third recommendation, I think it was mentioned, we need to have the facilitation of this expertise, this security risk management expertise, but it has to go beyond grants. We know that grants give us eligible costs to put some, whatever, direct costs, but most of the time it's considered as indirect. Most of the time it goes into the structure costs. Most of the time it's limited. So we need to have some kind of lines to be able to finance those needs beyond eligible cost. It has to be ad hoc funding. Could also be, by the way, lump sum that donors could provide us just to build the acceptance of our project within communities. We don't know how we're going to spend the lump sum. We start the project with an open line that we will actually use throughout the project where we will actually identify things that will actually reinforce the acceptance of the organization. You know, this has nothing to do with rules and forcing device, but it's clearly something that could clearly help. There is something about training, and I know that Europe is very keen of the HEAT training, and we agree that HEAT training is a good training. But again, we should be very careful that it's not maybe the best training in situations like Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, or Ukraine today. Maybe it's at the first level, but then we need to go into something a bit more. So again, certification might be a bit risky here. So maybe let me just finish with maybe an idea that was not given so far, which is security imperative of states supported by their donors or ECHO, or should preserve humanitarian imperative and not compromise the security of the humanitarians. I think it's important. We didn't mention so far in this conference the screening of beneficiaries, but that's a question that we've been discussing a lot in France recently, and I guess in many other countries. That puts our team at risk because we are not a police department, and of course, if we start to screen our beneficiaries, that decrease the level of acceptance and put a clear threat on the security of our employees. So again, here it's it goes against any rules on any top-down. It's same with I was in a de-risking discussion just before, and it's true that this de-risking on banks is putting a lot of pressure on our shoulder because we need to transfer cash from one place to another. And we are actually, by handling this large amount of money, we are at risk. We are targets for bandit and armed groups. So really, in a nutshell, of course, we should get into dialogue with our donors. They should come and check and see what system we have in place. Again, it's not because we have 60 employees in security and access that we are, unique. Most of the organizations today have reinforced their security department as we have done at HI. But it should be a dialogue. It should be, making sure that you understand that we are taking the best use of the financing that we get, that we need more money to go beyond that. But at the end of the day, I'm clearly against going further in terms of certification on any other label. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel, and thank you for giving us a clear answer. At least your answer to this question. I'm not sure every organization will have the same answer. Such an interesting presentation, Manuel. Thank you. I took a lot of notes, and I have many questions that comes in my head that I could ask you now, but and I also see that we have a few questions from the Slido, and thank you very much. And please, for the people online, continue to raise your question on the platform, and in the room, if you have any question, please just raise your hand. We are going to be very informal about it, and raise your hand, and we will make sure that you get a mic and are able to answer your question. So, as I say, I have many questions about the different things that you say, but maybe we can start with one of your last points. So you were talking about preserving the humanitarian principle, I would say, in that way to avoid endangering our staff, right? And for me, this is very linked to one of the questions that was raised in the slide about the politicization of ED, but also to another question that is also on the slide, which is related to counter-terrorism laws and requirements. These are not the same things, but they are somehow linked in this question. So how could we do that? How can we depoliticize aid in such a way that it's going to stop undermining our neutrality, of course, but because we are here to talk specifically about security, I will emphasize on the security aspect of it. I will ask it to you, and then another member of the panel may complete your answer.
All right. Neutrality is a concept that is quite complex. How neutral can we be when we believe that our values, what we call universal values, we believe that they are, universal. but it seems that it's not fully shared across the globe. So can we be neutral by actually following those values on trying to enforce those values in everything that we do? So I think the neutrality concept is always very complicated, and we kind of need to choose the fact that we are supporting those values, and we are trying to make sure that everything that we do is abiding by those values. But clearly, the politicization of aid is a slightly different question, which is, can we make sure that we answer the needs first, and we do that in an indiscriminative way? And it's true that if we do so, if we find ways to have the community that we work for actually completely embark in what we do, I believe that we can build at the same time, acceptance, and at the end of the day, the security of our workers, our employees. So the fact that we start from the needs, we work with communities, we work with partners, local partners, that's the way for us to clearly demonstrate that even though the money comes from a Western government that actually have embedded the universal values, at the end of the day, we find a common ground, which is we answer the needs on the best possible way.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And maybe I will ask Heather, because as the Deputy Director of GISF, I'm very sure that that's discussions that you are having with your members' organization around the politicization of aid and the depoliticization of aid. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit how you engage at a higher level, and maybe with donors or maybe even with states on those questions. That would be very interesting, I think, for the people in this conference.
Sure. Is this working? Yeah. It is, okay. I'm not sure that I have much to add, to be honest. I mean, I think it's a very, very similar starting point, which is that we've done a lot of work at GISF on acceptance with our members across a whole range of kind of issues related to acceptance. But for us, that's sort of a key issue, and working on impartiality, working with in local communities, understanding the needs and meeting the needs and being impartial. I think those are some of the sort of the key issues as have already been stated, really. Yeah, I don't really have much to add.
Thank you. If Nick or Camille, you want to add something. Otherwise, I wanted to jump to another point that you made, but it was also made in a session earlier that was in this room, where we were discussing, like the panel was discussing engaging with non-state armed group, and they were discussing about risk appetite and how much risk are we willing to take in order to make these discussions happen. We know that it's not always easy. I think in some locations, I have conducted myself this type of talks. Sometimes you can have them very easily. You just have to get the correct mobile phone number, and then you call, and then you can meet the person. In some other countries, it can take months just to build the contacts that will allow you afterward to go to these meetings. So the question of this risk appetite is very key in many organizations now. So maybe I was wondering, Camille, if you could explain to us how IRC, your organization, is handling that, and how what is the role of the security department, I would say, security unit, into accompanying this access efforts.
Sure. For the non-geek here, the risk appetite is the balance between the risk we are agreed to ask our staff to take on the ground and the benefits for the beneficiary. So it's always a balance. And the question is, who is going to take this decision? Because I think your question is quite relevant. What is the role of the security department? As a security department, usually we are only advisors. We are not the one who takes the decision. So how do we influence, or which argument do we give to the decision makers to make sure that we take the right decision? And this decision will be right for the people on the ground. And I think even inside an organization as IRC, we could sometimes disagree on the level of risk appetite we are going to take according to the location. Even in one country, I'm thinking about, touchy area where we implement programs which are not always accepted by the community, like, the protection for women or cash distribution. They are dangerous programs. In Yemen, for example, our staff can think that, well, it's fine, we can go for this. And a country director, international, who maybe doesn't know so well the context, can say, well, no, we don't want to take any risk because I don't want to cause the death of our staff. Both points of view are relevant, and I'm sure with a lot of good arguments behind this. But it's not a simple question, and I think we need to find a mechanism to get closer to the right decision at the end. So this question of risk appetite, risk balance, and our will to go further can differ according whose point of view. So at the end, I think it's more the question of who is deciding, who has the final decision on this. And our role, I would say, as security advisor, is to guide and to have a 360-degree angle to make sure that we don't forget any point, and at the end, that we make sure that we are the safest, but also serving our operations. So it's not an easy answer for sure.
It's not an easy way because I think there is no standard ways to do that. Today it's very much done to the level of each organization to try to find a risk appetite policy and figure out their own risk appetite statements. I remember we first started working with that when I was working in Action Contre la Faim very early around in the 2010, 2011, and I guess we were one of the first organizations back in those days trying to set up this risk appetite policy. I look back at this work now with my experience, and I probably figure out that I would do it very differently now, but the sector has changed a lot as well. But I totally agree with you that today is still very much something that is a work in progress for most of the organization, and that's kind of a paradox, right? Because we are sending people out there. They are there, and at the same time we are saying, maybe we have not yet clearly defined what is the frontier, what is the border, what is the red line. We hate the word red lines, actually, in our work. But where do we stop? When do we stop? And what type of casualties and damages are we willing to sustain, and are we willing to tolerate in the process of doing our work? Obviously none, but the fact is, and Nick reminded us of the facts, of the figures, we do lose colleagues every year and every day, once per day, that's what you said earlier. One of our colleagues is impacted in the field. And that's something that I think should stay with us when we discuss this type of topics here, right? So going back to the money now, because I think it's kind of a passion of mine, the budgets and the security budget. Oh, yes, of course, please, Nick.
Just to come in on briefly on the politicization, I think we have to be realistic here. We're not going to solve it. Aid will be politicized indefinitely, and that's the right, let's say, of donor governments that provide it. Where the decision point rests is with the operational country director, who's kind of sitting there in an environment where they've been tasked by their HQ to grow the portfolio. They've got an option to, take a grant that requires close coordination with the Ministry of Public Health. That's going to mean that you're going to have a government official traveling in your vehicle once a week to go and do programmatic assessments, and that's the person that's going to get blown up. It's as simple as that. So I think, we, as a community, we should stop imagining or tricking ourselves that we can depoliticize aid. It's always going to be there. The point of real impact comes at the point where you make a decision as an operational organization as to which grants you go for. So the more NGOs that opt out of PRTs and 3Ds and triple nexus and everything else that goes with it, the better, in my view. So, it comes down to a funding and sustainability issue. Just on the point around, negotiations, I think someone mentioned heat is a really kind of wonderful thing that everybody loves to do, heat trainings. I would say we're shifting now towards HN is the new thing. So humanitarian negotiations is the biggest new trend in kind of NGO training generally. And I'm sure you're aware NRC and INSO have worked on a very big program globally together, which really NRC led and allowed INSO to tag along. So we appreciate that. But this has now really become something that's become very mainstream. And the crux of it is trying to standardize and mainstream the skills for negotiation, regardless of which actor and kind of context you're conducting that within. So I think that's a pretty important development. It's certainly new within my experience of the sector to see such a focus being placed on, someone described it as soft skills. And the idea that, what you're really training people in are human negotiation skills. So it's becoming a little bit more advanced like that, and it wouldn't surprise me if, another 5 years down the road, that humanitarian negotiations training becomes a new baseline standard, as opposed to just a heat training for a deployment to a high-risk country.
Absolutely. I'm actually just coming back from Cameroon, and for the last 3 weeks they have been running intensive training of trainer for this specific trainer, and actually INSO was part of it, and they were running some sessions. So definitely something that NRC is really invested in, and at least in NRC, humanitarian negotiation is already part of our HEAT and the national equivalent, which is the HEIST, and those are mandatory courses to be taken into those trainings. So definitely we recognize that the soft skills are an important part of security. But I also want to continue this discussion, and I think I fully agree with you about the fact that our sector can dream and want to depoliticize ed. I think the nature of ed make it that it's always going to be at least partly politicized, yes. But maybe that was interesting because you raised it, that the choice that we have in the sector is selecting the grants that we want to accept or not accept. Unfortunately, maybe not all the organizations are in these positions. Like when you have a strong, solid organization with a large portfolio, you can afford this luxury. And I'm actually saying it's a luxury to be able to decline a grant. But more often than not, we are pushed by donors to go to areas where we are not ready to operate, we are not comfortable to operate, or maybe even we don't want to operate. And in the end, there is this very hard to reach area over there, and this donor is asking you to go there. And this is actually a question that I wanted to ask you, Nick, so maybe you will continue. Don't you see that there is this paradox that we have right now between donors pushing us to go to this hard to reach area, and at the same time being reluctant to increase the funding of security risk management system, may that be the gadgets, like some of my teams like to call it, but may that be also training on the soft skills or the HEAT, the HEIST, or sometimes just the staffing, because we know that's something that is the most expensive in our security budget, our security staff.
It's quite a complex question, I think. The starting point for me is that, and again, maybe this stems out of kind of being a founder of an organization, but it gives you the view that, like, it shouldn't be donors telling us where to go. We should be going to donors and saying, this is where we've identified needs, and, and we've already made our assessment to the extent that we can be there. And are you going to fund this? So I think there's probably something a little bit inherently wrong if the direction of travel is a donor saying you need to go and work over there and you work out how you do it. But then I think it really just comes down, and again, thinking about this really on the NGO side of the house, like I don't want to speak for donors, but leading an NGO myself, like leadership matters in these situations. Like leaders of organizations need to be able to say, you know what, we can't do that without violating the principles that we signed up to. And even if it means we're not going to get the money for it and we will diminish in terms of our total income next year, we're fine with it. And we will be a smaller NGO that does less. Or we will exit this country entirely because we can't work there in a principled manner. And you do see NGOs taking those positions. Sometimes they'll say, well, look, we can't do it, either for principles or for kind of, core assertions of safety. So I think, again, it's kind of a little bit easy to say, well, someone else pushes us to do these things, but I think we need to reflect more ourselves on, what type of organizations we are, how well we defend our own principles when we're faced between, a choice of standing up for that principle versus organizational growth and development. And, it's a bit of a problem generally in the sector is that we don't countenance the ideas that NGOs can get smaller and do less. We only think about them doing more. And fundamentally, this is in contradiction with a kind of generally principled approach to running an NGO. I mean, I'm happy to sit up here and say I'm happy for INSO to stop if there's no need for it. It was invented to address a particular need. If that need is no longer there, let's wrap it up and, go home and do something else. I don't know how many other NGOs adopt that position.
I'm sure on the principle, many. As for the facts, I kind of agree with you that we are more on a race, a fuite en avant, like we say in French, on the growth and increasing the footprints, being to go deeper, to go stronger, to go faster. And that's exactly what Camille was saying. That's the drive, that's the push in the organization. And I think also a lot of our organization may lack the flexibility to do that, because also downsizing means also downsizing in terms of staffing. We also have donors, and that's something that I have experimented in NRC, that ask us to be more flexible. Like they want, okay, that we do an emergency response there, and then we need to set up a full office, but then 6 months later, this office we don't need because the people are displaced, and we would need to stop this and start working somewhere else. But our organization also don't have the flexibility that this requires. And for many reasons, that could be very much linked to the local labor laws as well, but also the fundings, because opening and closing an office cost a lot of money, because it's recruitment, because it's investing in buildings, investing in transport, in staff that we need to train, and et cetera, et cetera. But Heather, I think you wanted to complete this answer.
Oh, just to agree with a lot of what Nick said, to be honest, but also, I guess, to make the point that there is a point where we need to push back with donors and to have a really open and honest conversation, and to be clear about, what the actual costs are for security risk management. And if there is some pressure or some push to work in a particular area that we feel we're not equipped to do, we don't have either the equipment or the soft skills, or we haven't done our negotiation and access training, or, that's where we need to sort of be realistic with donors and say, this is what it actually costs for us to work here in a way that's safe and secure for our staff and our teams, and also for any implementing partners we might have, or for local and national organisations. These are the actual costs, and this is what you will need to fund for us to be able to work here. But I don't think that is a conversation that's necessarily had at a very open and honest level within NGOs or between NGOs and donors.
Yes. You raised at this point in your intervention earlier, that's some space of improvements, let's say, within the organization would be to get better at estimating the cost of security. And not only the hard cost, but also the soft cost. What are the obstacles? What are the challenges? Concretely, what do we need to do to make us better at this very pragmatic thing?
Also a very complex question. I think there's you know, a lot of organisations, as we've just talked about, operational organisations kind of are going from one grant to another grant to another grant to sort of respond to specific things. So it's hard if you're trying to develop the capacity of your organisation to strengthen security risk management, to have that as a really sort of holistic and overarching approach when you're kind of you know, getting grants for specific things. As you said, working on this emergency, 6 months later, people have moved elsewhere or displaced elsewhere. And so it's hard to sort of, for NGOs, I think, to be to have a strategy in place that they can get funded as a whole strategy, rather than just taking pieces out of it and getting, you can get training funded at the moment, I'm sure, for staff going into Ukraine or staff, you know, going to Yemen, but it's a sort of a time and a place rather than a more strategic approach. So I think it's both on the NGOs to be more realistic about what's needed, but also to have that conversation with donors about a more kind of sustainable and strategic approach to how security risk management can be improved, and not just sort of hopping from one emergency to the other.
I've also witnessed a certain shyness from the organization to go in front of the donor and actually request security funds, which is kind of paradoxical, because the message you get for a lot of the donors, at least the bigger one, and ECHO is one of them, is that there is funding for security. But I kind of observe from our own sector a reluctance to go and to push for more security funds. And this maybe we can come back to later, because Manuel, you wanted to add to this, and I also had a question for you after, so go ahead.
No, but just building on what you said, I think a concrete recommendation from donors is that they should actually ask for specific acceptance activities more than they do, and this should be direct costs. Because of course there is, there is equipment, there is a staff that we need to have, but the biggest part of the cost today for us is really the staff going, opening the different, roads, and going to discuss with the different parties to a conflict. On that time, that staff, on that. Really related to a project. If we do a project in a given area, then there is a full amount of activities that we need to launch in terms of, making the connection and building the acceptance. And this can clearly be part of a project. You want to deliver, if it's a child, it's going to be, psychological support, or you want to be able to provide a rehab center or support to any kind of distribution. What are the acceptance activities you're going to do part of the project? And I think that's something that I've seen, but not so often in grants. So maybe that's a concrete thing that could maybe bridge the issues about, how do we finance, and how do we make sure that donor can influence a bit more the different organizations.
Thank you, Manuel. Please don't keep your mic. I will just make a case that I definitely acceptance activity cost should definitely be direct cost. But I think I would push a little bit further and say that security costs in general should be direct costs. For those who are not familiar with the way grants are given, we generally split the cost of an organization in two big parts, like what we call the direct cost or the program cost. So that's the funds that goes directly into the implementation of the humanitarian activity. And then there is what we call the support cost or the overhead cost. Like there are many different vocabulary, so it's become more complicated and more technical. But there is a certain percentage between those two costs, a ratio that needs to be respected when an NGO submits a budget proposal to a donor. And if you don't respect it, then probably you are going to have questions and requests to review your budget. So right now, security is mostly considered as an overhead cost, which of course you imagine is the smaller percentage of this ratio. So in some organization we manage to put some of the security cost in the direct cost and some on the support. But for some organization this flexibility is a little bit more complicated, because they might not have the support platform like with finance managers that can do all this budget magic, as I call it, very technically. So definitely having a stand from the donors saying that, yes, security is recognized as being a direct cost would definitely help the organization to allocate more to security. I just see that we have someone in the room who wanted to intervene. So do you want to come in front to make sure that you're catched by the camera, and we will give you a mic, and Heather, I will give you the floor just after this. But I also wanted to round up on the risk transfer. Can you? Great.
I will try not to check too much. So Anne-Sophie, nice to meet all of you. Just really interesting discussion about donors, positioning, and security costs. One of the things that is not discussed right now is that all donors don't have the same positioning. And today we are hosted by European Commission, so checking is starting a bit, sorry. But there is other big donors which are not opening the door to security costs. And for sure, ECHO and European Commission said, okay, yes, of course, we want to support your security cost, but we cannot support the whole security cost of your all operations. And if you go back to the other donors, you have local organizations applying to the same fund as you, as a middle-sized or small-sized ENGO. They are going on some very deep place, high risky places with no any kind of security protection for the staff. And so if you want to have access to this fund, so you just cancel all your security costs, and yes, you have to deal with low level of security for your own staff, for yourself, so there is kind of like balance and decision to make, which are quite difficult. And yes, sometimes EU and other donors push you on one sense, saying you have to go to this place, very high risky places. And they say, but we cannot give you the money you need to go there because we already found a specialized NGO like INSO, for example, which are very fantastic NGO, and I love them, and they save life. So it's not a complaint, but they have to choose between giving money for security analysis or for security of NGO personnel. And there is really a big difference between being one of staff member from one of the big NGOs like Mercy Corps, Action contre la faim, NRC, DRC, and being a staff from another type of NGO, which are like middle size. And this is two different games, two different worlds. So yeah, need to find a way for middle size NGO if you want us to continue being on the field. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. I think it's a very, very interesting point that you make, and that actually allows me to round up to the question of the risk transfer. I just want to maybe underline what you were saying. It's true that a lot of us on this stage today, we represent quite bigger organizations that have allegedly more means and have done quite a lot of work into dedicating funding to build our security management system. But that does not represent all the organizations out there, and a lot of organizations have struggled still to put some of the basics in place. So these questions that we are having about having more support from the donors in terms of funding security would have a huge impact for those organizations. And those are the organizations that very often we use to go to the hard-to-reach areas. That's, I would say, the last mile organizations that I was talking about earlier when we were talking about the risk transfer. And that actually was a question that I wanted to ask you, Manuel. How do you consider this risk transfer? Are you now in your organization at a stage where you are trying to do something about it, or maybe you are thinking about it. I know it's a big struggle in many organizations. It's an ethical question, so I'm quite happy to hear your answer.
I like the idea of mitigating risk, but I hate the idea of transferring risk. What we collectively need to do is to reduce the risk. We cannot avoid the risk, but we can reduce the risk. But the idea of transferring the risk, I think it's completely unethical. We need to share the risk, the remaining risk. So, of course, sometimes we've seen that in some of the evolutions of different policies. You know, again, well, let's talk about screening of beneficiaries again. But we could talk about other policies, and we've seen that the way the contract was framed between primes and subs. We clearly noticed that there was a transfer of risk between NGOs. And I consider this as clearly being completely inappropriate. When we are partners, we share the risk. We have to do that as prime as well. So it's, this perspective is also a perspective that is engaging HI. But transferring the risk is for me clearly the bad idea. And we've seen the discussion about the bank de-risking panel on actually, again, that's an idea of you know, sometimes the financial institutions, they're very good in risk management, and they're very good in trying to, you know, have some kind of a way to make sure that at the end of the day they will not lose any money. But for us, it's not a question of money. It's a question of life. So we need to take that very seriously and collectively. And that's why I don't like the concept of transferring risk.
Thank you, Manuel. And I would like to ask the same question to Camille, because obviously in your position as a regional security director, you obviously have to face some of those questions. You're very close to the field and advising on how to manage those partnerships that we may have with implementing partners. Do you have in IRC any specific procedures for that to evaluate the security risk management of your partner or would-be partner? And do you think this is something that a donor, like ECHO, for example, should have a system in place that would say, for example, to an organization, we give you these grants, and if you are going to use implementing partners, then you have the responsibility to ensure that this partner have a sound security risk management system. Choose the question you want to answer.
I'm okay to be an advisor for ECHO. So, no, I think in IRC we are now working on this partnership and the collaboration with our partners. It's a very interesting topic. We have a long way to go. The notion you mentioned, Manuel, is very important, the notion of equal partnership. Like, to don't take any of the part as inferior. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, we were looking at a partner with a questionnaire, and we were doing like a kind of investigation on their capacity to become a good partner or no with our standard as big NGO. Now we have really switched this, and we are in another area where we consider both of us under scrutiny and where we also need to deliver. And sometimes it's not a question of budget, it's not a question of money, it's a question of link and relationship and collaboration. Do ECHO or other donors should put some standard? I think it's already the case in a way when we feel the first contract. It's not a contract, but when we speak about the partner we choose, there is some question about how the collaboration can work and which area in security we can build together. So maybe it's just the beginning of this, but I think we are in the right direction in terms of partnership and collaboration and how security can work for both of us.
Go ahead, Heather.
Just to add to that, GISF has worked for the last couple of years on this issue of partnerships and security risk management, and did some research, and then last year produced a joint action guide on working in partnerships for anybody who's interested in that. Obviously, it's a very detailed, a very practical guide, and has lots of great tools and checklists and so on for exactly this conversation between different organisations. But it really tries to reframe the conversation, moving away from risk transfer to risk sharing, and how you can do that. And I think some of the key things are just, as have been mentioned by others on the panel, having or starting from a position of sort of where everybody's equal, and having open and honest discussions, being frank about what the risks are, what the who's taking what risk, and being clear about that, and being able to so have those open conversations to sort of start your discussions on partnerships.
Thank you, Heather. I think we all want to answer to these questions because we are all in the security sector. So it completely goes against the grains to this idea of endangering someone else in order to save ourselves. Like, that's really not our business. That's not what we do. So we are very passionate about these questions of risk transfer. I think also, Nick, you wanted to add something on this.
I'm going to add something a bit different. I don't want to be a contrarian. But, I mean, and I, of course, completely agree as a starting position with, equal access, equal rights, equal support to national NGOs where international NGOs are working with them. But to give you the benefit of, hard data, the topic of kind of risk transfer within the context of the localization debate has become very, very high profile in the last 2 to 3 years, yet say. And the statistic that's often cited as the kind of key demonstrator of that is the very true fact that over 90% of NGO casualties, so fatalities, injuries, and so on, every single year, year on year, are national staff. This is 100% true. The part that gets missed, though, is that 90% of NGO staff are national staff, which just makes it a demographic issue. The other part that's missed, and again, no one really has a lot of data on this outside of us, maybe OCHA. So our registered partners around the world are national and international NGOs. It's just under 50-50. So it's about 47% local NGOs, the rest international. But the volume of incidents affecting local NGOs hovers between 25 and 30%. So in reality, in terms of hard data, the international NGOs are significantly more impacted still in the field than national NGOs are. And it's also the case that the national staff that are cited in that 90% plus being, all victims, are principally the national staff of international NGOs. And this mistake is commonly made in that people will take the national staff figure and assume that national staff means national NGO. It doesn't. The vast majority of national staff in any humanitarian response are the national staff of international NGOs. So, again, I didn't want to, play the contrarian, and of course, organizations that partner with local NGOs have a duty of care, have a responsibility, and, it's part of the founding ethos of INSO that to provide, indeed, this equal access and equal rights to local NGOs, to make sure that they have access to the same training, information, support as international NGOs do. But I do think there's a nuance missing from the conversation around risk transfer and localization, which is that, like I said, statistically, it doesn't look at this point like national staff, which of course 100% of local NGO staff are national. It doesn't look like, from just pure raw data, that local NGOs are particularly worse affected than international NGOs. And actually, the most vulnerable category amongst all is the national staff of international NGOs. Just want to make that clear.
Thank you very much, Nick. These are very interesting precision, and I think using facts is a way to depassionate the debate and also counter some perceptions. I would say that we can also question the reporting maybe of some incident that may affect NGOs. I know that a few years ago, international NGOs had very bad reporting system for incidents, and we have had a lot of development in the last few years, and definitely the same move has been done in the national NGOs. So we also can see the figures starting to come in, and have very clear data is also very important for us to define policies. Maybe moving away a little bit from this very interesting and passionate theme of the risk transfer, and also because you mentioned the duty of care, I want to raise one of the questions that came from Slido on the duty of care and the coverage of duty of care, of one specific aspect of the duty of care by the donors. As you explained it to us, Camille, a bit earlier, the duty of care includes the physical and psychological well-being of the staff. It is true that we kind of cover, let's say, the physical aspect, because maybe something we are more familiar with and we have been working on for longer, but the psychological aspect is still a little bit neglected. And sometimes it's very hard to discuss the coverage of this psychological well-being with donors. So maybe I wanted to ask you, Camille, if you had a few words to say on that.
I don't have the answer to this question. The question is, donors are still reluctant to include psychological support within direct cost. How to advocate for that? I don't have the answer, but just the fact to speak about this, to say that psychological support is a part of our job and a step after an incident will contribute to this advocacy. And it's one of my battle, even with my guys, you know, the field security coordinator or officer, to don't forget this aspect, the psychological support of the victim, of our staff, of us. The vicarious syndrome is something very important also among us. We are dealing with very severe incident. It has an impact on us physically, mentally, and this is something that more we will discuss about it, more we will be able to advocate, and then maybe someday to have it as part of the cost.
Thank you very much, Camille. I'm actually taking some notes on what you are saying, and maybe I will add a few words on this. When I started in 2010 with ACF already had a staff care, like a full-time staff care psychologist. The time that was Cyril Cozart, and then he was replaced by Marianne Kedia. And I think at that time that was the only organization that had an in-house, full-time psychologist dedicated to the staff care of the staff. And ACF was implementing something that was crazy for the time, like crazy advanced and crazy good. Every single staff that were going to the field had a briefing with the psychologist. The psychologist also had a session in what they called like the pre-departure training sessions that was mandatory for anybody going to the field with ACF. And at the time of each contract, the people were coming back to the head office, that the expats were coming back to the head office and have debriefing. And the debriefing with the psychologist would be mandatory, like at least would be planned. So the expat would have the right to sign off of this and say, no, thank you very much, but I don't want it. But by default, it was on the planning. I think that was really a leader organization for this back in the time. Now you see more and more of this. I mean, in NRC, we have an amazing coverage. I know Save the Children have done a lot of things on this. But I guess we go back to the same division lines that we already alluded to. You have kind of two words within the NGO sector. You have the big organizations that have quite secure funding and are a little bit more advanced on those questions, and they were able to plan and implement a system that is there where they can provide support services for their staff. And you have smaller organizations or middle-sized organizations that still very much struggle with that. And this is very costly. Now in NRC, it is mandatory for every single country office to have a contract with a psychologist or a psychologist company that can provide immediate support for our staff. And very recently, we are in the discussion, and in most countries now it's available, that this support is not available only after an incident, but also for the staff to access to when they struggle with some issues. Because they live and they grew up in places that are high-risk areas. So it's not only when they face an incident that they may need this type of support. But I'm very aware that I work in an organization where we are privileged to have access to this type of support. And funding this is very important. Then again, I will promote a little bit Action contre la faim because they are doing some amazing work. In some countries, they implemented a consortium where different, like 4 organizations comes together, and together they employ a full-time psychologist that is going to be present and support the 4 organizations. This has a cost. The way around this is that the cost is split between 4 organizations, but it's still an investment for an organization to do. This is a very strong leadership from Action contre la faim. It exists, I think it's in Burkina Faso, in DR Congo for sure, in Central African Republic, and NRC is glad to be part of this system. I would like to see this type of system being increased, particularly in countries where we know it's very difficult to access to psychological care, quality psychological care for the staff. So maybe that's also one of my special interests that I wanted to push, and this question was very interesting. I don't know if one of you want to add something about this.
No, it's really important. This piece is really something that sometimes is completely missed. So it's good that you mentioned different organizations that have progressed. You could add to the list HI, of course. But what is interesting is the mutualization that you've mentioned on the different countries that you've mentioned. I have the example of Central Africa, where actually we have a psychologist in-house, and we share this person with all the other organizations in Bangui. And I think, just to give an example, so looking for mutualization platform, could be INSO, could be other platform that could actually, have those expertise in-house and could clearly put that expertise for all the other organizations is maybe something we should look at. But today it's done by each of us. When we have a resource, we put it at the service of other organizations. I think that's how we deal with it now. It works. But maybe we could think in terms of having an organization that actually mutualize this support, because of course, for our team in Central Africa, we don't need one full-time psychologist. We need maybe 25% of her time. Actually, it's a she. So we don't need. So that's why we are putting that in common with other organizations. So maybe that's a discussion. Maybe INSO is the right organization. I don't know. But we need to have an organization that actually put that in common.
Thank you very much, Manuel, and. And I think this is going to be the last intervention of this session. We are running out of time, and we just have a few minutes to wrap up. So first of all, really, I wanted to thank the panelists that were here today. It was a pleasure to have this discussion with you. I also want to thank you in this room, and also thanks the person on the platform online for their questions. We were able to tackle some of them, not all. I'm sorry about that. Just wanted to wrap up this session. I think we have come a long way in terms of security. We are nowhere close to where we were 10 years ago or 12 years ago, at least when I started my career. I see the progress that have been done by all types of organizations. We are more structured. Security is high on the agenda in most of the organization, even the middle-sized one, even the smaller one, that they don't have a lot of means, but they are still interested, they are still discussing the matter, they are still willing to request more funds about it. And I think this is something that we should celebrate, because that was not the case 10 years ago. And by discussing these issues, we are moving forward and we are saving life of people who saves life. That's our job, and I think we are all very happy to do that. Thanks for the statistics. Thanks for keeping up in line with what the facts are. Something that I wanted to say earlier, but I didn't have a lot of time to say, is that yes, we don't have such a high level of humanitarian head workers that are impacted, but how much of this is actually linked to the self-restriction that we give to ourselves, like the shrinking of the humanitarian space, that make it so that even though we would like to go to this very hard to reach location, we are actually imposing ourselves not to go. So transfer of risk is a strategy that we want to avoid, but actually avoidance is also one of the risk strategy that we use a lot, and by default and not by our own choice, but because the situation is just too risky and we cannot go there. How can we go there? By talking between ourselves, by more mutualization, and I'm really happy that you say those words at the end. I think that should be the word of the session, mutualizing, but also discussing with donor, engaging more with the donor, asking more funds. I think we should not be so shy about asking for the funds that we need, but we need to be able to provide understandable costs, like costs that we have calculated, and not just broad estimations because we don't have any idea of what security costs. So maybe one of the things that we should do as an organization is train our security staff better in terms of budgeting and what budgeting means, and how to request the funds, how to calculate how much you need for managing security. I think that would be very, very important as well. Continuing this discussion about the risk appetite, I think this is also the way forward. I think organizations should have internal mechanisms that define procedures on how to define their own risk appetite and stick to it. And that's probably one of the very difficult parts is to stick to it. And maybe because I work for NRC and we are a principled organization and we care about humanitarian principle a lot, I also would like to emphasize on something that you say, that we need to preserve humanitarian principles. This is also our work as security manager, to uphold the humanitarian principles, because those principles also protect us and avoid our staff to be in danger. Definitely something to keep in mind. And I'm over time now, so I will thank you very much for your attention and participation. I hope we will be able to continue these debates in other forums. I wish you a very nice day, and a very nice day tomorrow too. Goodbye. Cuts. Done. That was great.